First of all, I would like to thank the two speakers for their significant contribution offered on the topic of the seminar. What they said includes some aspects that are absolutely relevant for our province as well, concerning the intercultural and multilingualism components of our local education system. I would like to stress some of these aspects, in particular 3 points, that are connected with the contribution of this morning as well. I'll start from the situation of second-generation foreign students, that is, students born in Italy of foreign parents. Because according, I have a slide, according to national test on learning, in our province, but also in many other Italian regions, second-generation pupils at primary school in the 2nd and 5th grade perform worse than first-generation pupils of their age, both in Italian and maths. This situation is reversed in higher school levels, lower and upper secondary school. This morning we saw the media of the data, of this data. It's a strange situation. It seems that in preschool years, the social and family background, which is very important for educational process, is less effective for pupils born in Italy compared to pupils who are not born in Italy. Why this happens? Is it due to language reasons or to cultural reasons or to other reasons? For example, how the inclusion process in child care or nursery school happen? A second connect aspect regards the importance of expanding the language diversity within an intercultural approach, since the early childhood of the pupils. Neuroscience clearly tells us that multilingualism is a lifetime skill, but it's better you have to start learning early already in the womb. Here is a figure that confirms this. Therefore, we have to work a lot in preschool settings like childcare, nursery schools, but also in family settings to improve the multilingualism, to facilitate the contacts between the mother tongue and other languages. But yet we have a problem, a really big problem. We have a fairly good knowledge on what happens or doesn't happen at school, but we know very little about what happens in out-of-school context, especially in social and family ones, which are very important from cultural and language viewpoint. For example, we know nothing regarding code switching, which is used between 2 or more languages, between one mother's language and other language. In Italy, studies on the inclusion of foreigners focused a lot on social and economic aspects, and much less on issues related to language aspects, which are very important. There is a third observation, the last, I would like to make after listening to speakers this morning and this afternoon, and it is a question. How much will European education systems be ready to adopt a multilingual curriculum in a structural way? We have a lot of good practices at local level. But I think that our country are not really ready. Definitely not in Italy. For example, We don't know what language skills are learned more solidly when you study at the same time several languages, and how can we establish a multilingual vertical curriculum which is in line with the development stage of pupils. At the same time, despite the limitation of international and national tests, we have a lot of data about how good our pupils perform in mother tongue literacy, in maths and science, but we know virtually nothing about their multilingualism performance. In March of this year, PISA of OECD announced that it will introduce in 2018 a test also for a second language. But now this idea has been set aside for a lot of problems in each country. In Trentino, we have a trilingual plan which introduced trilingualism curriculum in the education system for the next years. Our institute is realizing how difficult it's to test this skill in a general, serious, and scientific way. There are very few international experiences we can refer to. The topic of language assessment involves more external certification agencies than education system, and that, in my opinion, aren't completely ready for an intercultural curriculum yet. I finish now just with this suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Behind or close to each high-profile professor, there are high-profile collaborators, colleagues, friends, and without any doubt, Cinzia is one of them. Within the Roberto Toniatti School of Constitutional Law and International Law, and there are brilliant young researchers, and Cinzia is definitely one of them. You have the floor, Cinzia.
Thank you for your generous words, and thank you to our organizers. For me, it's of course a pleasure to be among friends and colleagues. I've not thought of a presentation. I've interpreted my role as a discussant in this way. I will make some very general remarks, and then I have 3 questions for the 2 speakers. I am a constitutional lawyer, comparative constitutional lawyer, so my perspective is the constitutional one, dealing with pluralism. It is always very fascinating to deal with these interdisciplinary issues because you listen to other topics from other perspectives and you have to understand the definition, the concept, and so on. I would like to start by making some general remarks with regard to the topic we are dealing today, and which is, I think, crucial with regard to the relation between law and pluralism and societal framework today. This is a topic I connect to what I call, I don't know if this definition exists in English, but some sensitive places. School is a sensitive place somehow. And for sensitive places, I intend places where everything is played up. Schools is one of them. School is not the only one. Another one may be, for example, jail, prison, where different claims arise, different issues, and when there are different claims and with regard to different rights, and they are perceived as being very important, even if they regard daily aspect of life, and they are perceived more important than in other places. They are a kind of amplified. there is the right not to have haircut or to have a certain haircut, the right to eat only raw food, the right to pray during some part of the day, the right not to wear uniforms or something else. In schools, we have similar dynamics, and society pays a great attention to what is taught in schools to children and how there are always great struggles about this issue. And I think that the reason is that the way in which we educate our children is a part of our identity. We want to pass our values to children, and it is like they inherit our DNA. We want they inherit our values too. This is common sense. I'm not saying anything original. But this is also recognized in some legal documents. The most famous in Europe, at least, is Article 2 of the first protocol of the European Convention of Human Rights, where the right to raise your children according to your values, to have children educating according to your beliefs is recognized, is acknowledged. There is another reason, I think, which explains why it's so important, the dialogue among cultures in schools, and which explains somehow why, in many legal cases, schools were the places where societal advancements were promoted. There are many different cases. Brown versus Board of Education, I'm not original, of the Supreme Court was one of them. But if we think to the societal changes, we were behind the case like Handicide in European Court of Human Rights regarding the sexual education in schools. Or we can think of the many cases regarding religion, symbols, and pluralism in school. We always quote Lao Tzu. But there are, for example, all the case law regarding the French case, which is even more interesting, I think. So another reason why we pay so much attention to what is taught in school is that we are speaking of the legal recognition of societal changes, because school is somehow a mirror of society, of nowadays society, and of the society we want to build for the future. We hope that in school we are able to teach to the future citizens how to live together. And that's, I think, the key point, because the best way to require someone to behave in a certain way, to tolerate, to understand other culture, so to behave according to some basic values, and pluralism is one of these, the best way to teach them this is to be coherent with those values. So you, the person teaching, and you, the school where this education process is taking place, you have to be coherent with pluralism. From this point of view, I think that school are the place where society, where we, the grown-ups, we have the great opportunity to show that the grown-ups behave coherently with the values whose respect is taught and is required at school by children. And I think this was one of the issues at stake when we spoke so much about, maybe too much, about religious symbols at school. I say too much because in Italy it was a great, great issue. Because if you teach that pluralism is a value to be taught and to be respected, it is important to show to children that this same values is respected, first of all, by school and at schools. And I think that was one of the issues when our colleague from Catalonia was speaking about the option between the one plurilingual society or many monolingual society, which is a kind of similar to religion as it was considered by the Supreme Court, for example, in Canada, what they say, what is multiculturalism? Someone say different children playing together in the same schools, and other judges say, no, it is different children playing in the one religious school together where they all their own groups mates. This is a big choice because it has to do with the significance pluralism has as a value to be taught in school. I don't know if there is the right to coherence, I don't think so. But I think that the coherence at school deals with the concept of quality in education. Because quality in education from this particular point of view means and gives meaning to the concept of quality in society, quality of citizenship, citizens we have in society. So one of the big issues is to choose what is quality in society. Because all the issues I mentioned, religion, culture, languages, are part of expression of identities. But many times it is very difficult to have a balance between the promotion of pluralism as a value and the protection of the different identities, the promotion of your right to build up your own identity. And language is a very important part of identities. And we see, even through the teaching of languages, sometimes there is a clash between promotion of identity and pluralism. In fact, when we look at legal documents regarding the teaching of languages and more generally education, in many cases the relation between law and pluralism at school is no more defined as multiculturalism, but it is defined in terms of interculturalism, which is an adjective. I noticed that the colleague from Canton Ticino and also the colleague from Catalonia and also the colleague from the province of Trento used. So my first question was, how do you see interculturalism through the teaching of languages when there is a clash between the promotion of one group identity and the promotion of pluralism? And another question, I hope I'm not too naive because I'm not a linguistic at all, but I noticed that you use multilingualism and plurilinguism as synonyms. I wonder, no, okay, so please explain me the difference because, okay, I don't think you speak at all of interlingualism. It is not something like interculturalism. So I wonder if there is a correspondence between interculturalism and some definition at linguistic level. So, sorry if this is too simple. Esperanto might be. It might be. Or maybe English. It is. So, first question was this. This change is not only called cultural change, because in many documents of for example, the Council of Europe, it is said that the teaching not only of languages but also of history must be intercultural. For example, history is very interesting because the Council of Europe say you have to teach that there is a majority in your society, but to have to explain the historical reason why that majority became a majority. And this is why in many, for example, South American, particularly in the Andean countries, many constitutions requires at constitutional level that you have intercultural education because of the colonial past. They say you have to teach that there is a majority, but explain why that majority is a majority. This is intercultural in education. In that constitutional document. So I think that in the teaching of language, but this is a question because I'm not an expert, we have both sides. We have the expression of your identity that must be acknowledged and I wonder if must be improved. And on the other side, language is a tool to improve intercultural societies, where individuals have the capability to understand each other. And I think that learning a different language is not only it does not only regards knowledge. I very in line with Patrizia Cordini when she spoke about the benefits, and with Gisella Langé when she said clearly is a Trojan horse. I think that we are speaking of the cultural attitude to thinking that the way you look at the war is not the way everyone looks at the war. It's your way to look at the war. There are also others. In this sense, I agree that language is a tool, not only to understand each other, but also to have the cultural attitude to pluralism, if pluralism is a value, which I think it is. So I wonder if this concept of quality in education aimed at quality in society, because we started to build on society in schools, means that we should focus more on language as a tool in this perspective, but without disregarding the idea of language as identity. So how to put together, to balance these two aspects. And this is a question especially for the colleague from Catalonia, because there is not only the idea that you have the identity from inside, but also from outside. I wonder if there are some provision regarding immigrants to integrate not in the language of the nation, but in the language, for example, of a group, a minority group. Especially in Catalonia, I wonder if it is required, it is aimed that immigrants should integrate in Catalonian. But this is a question because I don't know it. And I think this might be an interesting way of approaching the intertwining between immigrants with their language, a group inside a nation with its language, and the national language. So I wonder if these three different levels are intertwining or not. This is another question. And another question is very specific. I hope I'm not too specific, but I want to know if you experience also to my colleague Luciano Covi, is because when we had a meeting with Patrizia Cordini last time, she told us something that was very surprising for me. She told us that many immigrants, especially in Trentino, I mean, when I'm speaking about the province of Trento, many mothers speaking Arabic languages, they spoke Italian at home with their children, which is something which I found is a pity, and is somehow sadness, because you speak an Italian which is not correct with your child. You don't have the opportunity to speak your own language, which is an enrichment, you see, of your child. And I wonder what is the reason. I'm not an expert of linguistics, the third time I say it, but this is clear now, sorry. I think that this is a kind of failure, but I do not have the tools to understand why and how this is a failure. So if you could explain this to me, and I wonder if it happens even in your countries too, in your experience, according to your experience. And I think I finished.
Thank you. Both of you, Luciano and Cynthia, raised quite relevant questions indeed. And these questions will not just be addressed to both speakers, but to the whole auditorium, because all of you are involved in this intellectual debate, and actually also in the questions being raised. A school should be a tool for pacification in society, but unfortunately, schools are also often a part of the problem. When I was chargé de mission and I had a meeting in Jerusalem, I invited top leaders from Palestinian side and from Israeli side. It was quite clear that consensus on coexistence and on peace should be starting at the very early level, at pre-primary education. Schools are often a part of the problem. Plurality of values will lead to plurality of tensions. And indeed, governments in Europe after the 90s just swift from idea of active citizenship to shared citizenship. Kind of, what are the common values? It's just not enough to as a migrant, to learn the national language and to follow some of the basic democratic discourse. But you should share also values of this society. Otherwise, it will be a problem having you as a formal resident and a national of this country. So shared values. Thank you so much for raising this question, because we are coping with these issues in all of our European countries for the next year, next decade. May I invite Brigitte and Monica to come to the forefront and start responding these fascinating questions. We will try, if you agree, to stop a little bit earlier. Although I will invite you to take also, all of you, to raise comments. But it's now, well, we will try to finish about 5:45, perhaps 20 to 6. So that 45 minutes earlier. Don't mention it. But we will try to be sharp, short. Please, you have the floor.
Well, I can answer the...
Shall we raise also some questions from the floor?
First, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's a better idea. Yes, please. So we'll collect.
Please introduce yourself.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Roberto. Grazie a loro, from Belgium. So, Brigitte,
From
if
Trento.
that would be a wish. So, when I was listening to your presentation, I thought that we were a country of consensus. But when I was listening to your presentation, I said we would never achieve what you do in Switzerland. So, do you have any explanation that such a diverse population reach in a disciplined way, without political upheavals, consensus on such sensitive issues that we discuss today? In Belgium, this is always problematic, and it seems to be without any problems that you regulate it in Switzerland. So is that a misunderstanding?
The Swiss model.
So we're collecting.
Yeah, collect all questions. That's a better idea. So
Of course, you also share very good chocolate. Any other questions? Sorry? Oh, I don't think so.
Thank you. I like to follow up on Gracien's question. So, adding to the from the federalist perspective, how much is there top-down and how much is there bottom-up, so self-coordination? Because you mentioned this quite often the word harmonization, which is a bit creating goosebumps on federal skin. But in a way, do I correctly have the impression that in a certain way the discourse in Switzerland is relatively similar to what we have heard this morning on European Union, so that there are kind of incentives, kind of standards, kind of also integrated or complementary competences rather than decision-making power by the federal level. Sorry. And for Catalonia, I would have a question, if I may, on school autonomy, because I think this was also quite intriguing that you, as far as I understood correctly, you can choose at school level, at the single school, although then you said 90-something% would choose English, but you could theoretically choose also the other languages. And how much is this school autonomy conditioned by, for example, the parents, and how much, for example, also in areas where there are many immigrants, this might play a role that immigrants insist on Castilian rather than, for example, to make an absurd example, German or others. Okay.
Thank you. Next question, please.
One is a comment and the other is a question. Just the comment on schools as sensitive places. We have used that. I've seen it in literature in the U.S., but they also include not just schools and prisons, but the military. As all and my students always find that kind of amusing, that schools could be compared to the military and prisons, but they're places where you lose control and where the government has more authority over you. A question, I find it interesting in hearing all the talk of what's going on at the local level, that, and I don't say this from a position that you should have followed the American model, because I think there are many problems in it, but I don't hear you saying that you look to the U.S., maybe Catalonia, maybe, I don't know, maybe you mentioned that, I don't know, of what we've done for 50 years of what we call bilingual education and the various approaches that have been used in what they use now in many schools, structured English immersion, where they put students of different languages into one classroom, but the curriculum is structured towards students and the materials structured towards students who don't speak English as their native language. So it's very language oriented, the curriculum itself, and students stay in this. It depends on the school system, and I have to say it's controversial because there was a law in Arizona that mandated it for 2 years. So what we call SEI, Structured English Immersion. The other approach that's become very popular are dual immersion programs, where you have 50% Spanish-speaking children, 50% English-speaking children in the same classroom, and the ideal model is 50-50 in terms of using the language through the curriculum. So we see these growing in Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, French. The French consulate now has someone hired in New York who I just interviewed him last week on this. He is responsible for building these programs from the bottom up, from these communities of young French couples, families moving into areas that were not very desirable in New York. And they're reinvigorating poor communities by moving in and providing these French-English programs. So a lot of middle-class and educated parents are looking for these programs because they want their children to be bilingual. So nobody's mentioned dual language immersion, and that is so hot in the United States now, but it could be because we're using languages that are more privileged. We're not using Farsi. We're not using even Arabic. Although there is an Arabic school, I believe, that opened in Texas now with some controversy surrounding it. So it's French, Spanish. There's now a little Italian program that opened up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn. But I have not heard either of those two terms used at all, structured English or structured immersion or dual immersion.
Yes, but this kind of things, it is a unique moment. It is small. Yes, at the back.
I'm a teacher. I teach English in a lower secondary school here in Trento. And I was deeply impressed by what the Perez, Professor Perez, told about learning to learn languages. I find it impressive because I think we should find that maybe the key point is to play on passion just for children. I mean, not in the most natural way. We should find the most natural way to passionate children in letting them want to learn languages by themselves. To make them, how could I say, maybe autonomous and independent within a society, within a team. That's what I think. Thanks.
I have two questions, yes. Well, the first is a very bare question, and it is concerning that point that has been shown on a slide on Canton Ticino, which has to do with what was written, éveil des langues. What do you mean? Is it an activity? Is it a purpose, a goal, or whatever? From what I understood, it seems to be very interesting because it seems that it is directed to making children sort of aware, perhaps even to have some passion in discovering, to play with languages, which perhaps is a very good way. Now, the second question is much more intrusive into the domestic affairs of Canton Ticino and of Catalonia, and of course also of Trentino, if you want to answer. My question is, to what extent is the legislation incorporating the policies that you have been describing sort of experimental? And to what extent do you have mechanisms that ensure evaluation of the outcome, of the efficiency of such policies, and allow for flexibility and change? I say this because one of the focus of this seminar is education as a generational right. In other words, I'm not so sure that I agree with Cinzia. Perhaps I do, perhaps it's a matter of nuance. But it seems to me that such policies aim to frame a society which is rather different from the one that we had yesterday, which is much more open to dialogue, which is much more European, international, intercultural, and the like. And perhaps it is as if my generation, not your generation, my generation realized that education is instrumental to achieving peace. I think it's a point that Jan made earlier today, making reference to Iraq, making reference right now to Israel and the like. So it seems to me that we want to change society through education. It seems to me that we haven't found the way. So again, my question, is your model, is your practice deliberately experimental? Does it include mechanism for evaluation of the outcome? Does it allow for some flexibility? And just for the sake of being even more intrusive, did you gather any scientific evidence on the ground on which to elaborate the policies? Or were the options more, let's say, ideological and political? Of course, it may be a very different way of asking the same question that Gracien has put to Switzerland. How do you build consensus? But it is interesting, I would say, to try to find out the scientific ground on which to decide, for instance, that 3 languages is a good target, and why 3 and not 4. And so that's my curiosity. And of course, evade the langue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It has struck me today, again, as the outsider. It has been really interesting for me to hear this, that you keep you talk of political rights, but not of legal rights. And you look to the supranational institutions to provide some statement of rights. You look to the Council of Europe or the European Union, and they, as you know, in terms of human rights, they have really no enforcement power. They have no teeth to them. Whereas in the United States, we have laws that have been adopted by our Congress that provide for the rights of language minority children. That's the way they were originally laws that were to protect race, non-discrimination in race and national origin. And national origin now, I mentioned this morning, has been used as a proxy for language. And so we have these statutes that the Supreme Court has also interpreted in a way that where the court is saying, well, these children have a right to a quote-unquote meaningful education, or to an appropriate education, or to an effective education, which is all language that's very, very vague too. And so it leaves still a lot of autonomy to the individual states and the individual school districts. But even with that, the national government has identified, as I showed you today, this toolkit and the guidelines, certain factors that should be included in what is a quality education for linguistic minority students. So there are laws that we have adopted in terms of positive law that protect students' rights, that hold schools' feet to the fire, as we say, even though they're somewhat vague, the federal government has become, and particularly the Obama administration, has become increasingly active in defining those rights more clearly. But I don't see that in any of your countries. You know, when you talk about rights, it seems to be looking to these other institutions to provide protections, but those other institutions have no enforcement power. But your individual countries don't seem to be taking on the lead.
Okay, first round.
Well, I don't know if I will remember all those questions, difficult questions, by the way. The first one I noted is the difference between plurilingualism and multilingualism. When we talk about plurilingualism is when we talk about the individuals. Individuals are plurilingual and communities or states or countries are multilingual. I think that's the description that has done also the European institutions. The second one, which was well, the language of schools and the school autonomy of the language for choosing the language. The education law in Catalonia says that there are two languages that have to be taught, which are Catalan and Spanish, and a foreign language, compulsory, since the 6th grade until the 16th. So this foreign language can be chosen between 4 curricular languages, which are English, French, Italian, and German. So every school can choose one of these as the first or the second. Some years ago, only secondary schools could have a second foreign language. Now some primary schools are also starting with a second foreign language, but they can decide if they choose English as the first or French or any of them. Of course, they chose them with the agreement of the families. They have to propose it in the school council, that is called the group where teachers, students, and families are. And for instance, there are some schools close to the French border that have decided that for them it's better to choose French as the first foreign language because they are a closer relationship between other schools on the other side, and there are exchanges of students, etc. So generally, schools choose English as the first foreign language, but there are some cases that they can choose for others. In relation with the, looking what happens in the States, in our case, the bilingual plan that was established at the 80s was very oriented first on the Quebec situation with French and English, but also I've been in California looking for this, how do you call, the sheltered learning.
It's either sheltered English immersion or structured English immersion. It's the same thing.
Well, for this thing, and also I have been visiting schools with these bilingual programs, 50-50, with Chinese, Mandarin, and Spanish. We have read a lot of literature about these programs. In fact, they are not doing nothing different that we have been doing with Catalan and Spanish. It's always 50-50. The difference maybe is that Catalan and Spanish are languages of the same family, so it's easier to make transferences and it's easier for the teachers to learn both languages. And in fact, it can be said, at least from my point of view, that it's a sort of clear thing that they are doing, but with more subjects than we are doing in our countries. Yeah, there are interesting experiences that. Yeah, and good findings, really. Mm-hmm. But I think that we have also good findings, and I think that this autonomy of the schools, not only for choosing the language that they are going to teach us first or second, but in choosing the methodologies and the way to work is also very important. And we are promoting very strongly to work through projects, the project work, learning, because it's really, and I will answer also the other question, that it's this learning by doing. It's just when you propose to the students some significative learning that they are going really to learn not only a language, anything that they experiment and they do because it's useful for himself or for herself. It's the only way to learn. And encouraging to work through these methodologies and to work through these methodologies, exchanging projects with other institutions, schools, or institutes of other countries through the Erasmus program really is working very, very well. And the schools that have this international dimension, that means that they keep on establishing relationships with different schools all over Europe, they perform better, not only in language learning, but in learning in general. And what else? Continue.
On common values, on pluralism of values, and to what extent language learning could contribute to a better understanding of each other?
Well, in fact, to learn a language is to learn a way of seeing the world. But now there's I think, a point, especially with English, this English that we are all learning at schools, that it's Lingua Franca, is really a language that transmits. Maybe you are an expert on this point, or you have some answers. For me, and for us as a government, it's a question that we ask very often, because with other languages, it's true that when you learn a language, you learn a way of acting and of learning and of living. But when we learn English with those purposes of international communication, just to, of course, there's a cultural component, of course. But when you learn this language with people from other cultures, that have other languages, that have conformed their identity, so we are learning something different, I think.
It is what they're saying. There could be many Englishes.
Yeah, yeah. Of course.
And they're being used by people. Somebody from Portugal is speaking to somebody, in China, using English, and so that's a different form of English than you and I would use. My being a native speaker and you and I.
Mm-hmm.
So it's being used as a common language for people who don't share a common language or a common culture, and so it's changing the aspect of, and a lot of the opposition to English as a lingua franca has come from intellectual elites and academics who say that it's linguistic imperialism, it's linguistic hegemony, we're being forced to adopt an Anglo-American point of view, and maybe it was at one time, but English itself is a language, and the concept of English is changing. It no longer belongs to America or to Britain. It belongs to the world, and I think it's
international community
to accept.
I would say it belongs to Britain just to begin with.
Okay.
Or to Canada or Australia.
Yeah.
It doesn't belong to the Anglo countries.
International community. Yeah.
It belongs to the world. And I think that makes it more acceptable for other people to say, well, yeah, it's not neutral like Esperanto. It isn't.
No.
It does carry historical and political baggage. We can't deny it. But I think a along the way it's going to start losing that baggage.
Okay, thank you. Brigitte.
Okay, me too. I have quite difficult questions. I will try to answer the one about the Swiss model as a linguist. So, I think when we think about the Swiss model, we have to bear in mind that we are a people of compromise and consensus, and our political work is really a consensus one. So this leads us to find always the solution that fits the best. This doesn't mean that we don't have very important discussions, but I think if you look at the whole situation, the language policy is a good example. The language policy, there have been huge discussions in the 90s about what languages should we teach in different regions of Switzerland at what point in the schooling to guarantee the lingua franca English, but also to guarantee the mutual comprehension between the different linguistic regions. And it was this that led us to this compromise to say we will study 2 languages at primary school, English and another one. And so was this top-down or bottom-up? I don't know. It led to this votation at national level about the harmonization. It raised the awareness that there can't be 2 huge differences. Otherwise, one or the other part of Swiss people don't feel integrated anymore. There is this huge discussion. It seems very peaceful, but it isn't, because what happens in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, where they start with English as the first, second language, there has been a huge discussion about demanding too much from the students at primary school, putting French 2 years later at the 5th grade. But we don't have this discussion in the part of Switzerland where they start with another language. How does it come? It doesn't surprise me, because there are studies that say that if you start with English as a first foreign language, the motivation to study the second foreign language diminishes. So what is political, what is evidence-based, and so on, it's very complicated sometimes. But we had this votation in 2006. So it was decided with a votation to put this in the constitution, so top down. And we had to try to find a solution bottom up. So I can't really explain it differently. What I wanted also to say is that you asked about evidence. But I think, and it was interesting what you mentioned before about interculturalism, I think we're also talking about cultural attitudes. In intercultural education, it's not only knowledge. In plurilingual education, we were, some years ago, we were supposed to develop a test of the plurilingual competence. But what do you test? What do you test? It's not so easy. There are also attitudes. How can you test attitudes? So there are soft skills also that you have to develop. And I think language teaching always transports this, to create a passion, to create an open-minded attitude. And perhaps I would return to the tree and your question about the éveil aux langues. When we put, perhaps it was a little bit fast before, but I think the very interesting innovation in our curriculum is that we put this plurilingual and intercultural dimension at an explicit level. We try to develop materials, teaching materials, few ones, but we would really like them to enter the school practice. And there are already some very interesting materials for éveil aux langues. They're tested, if you're interested, I can indicate. And they work on the curiosity of the small children in developing, exploring different sounds and different languages, and it works very well. For describing this part of our curriculum, we used a very, very powerful tool that I would like to mention, that perhaps you know, it's the GARAP. So we have the European Center of Modern Languages in Graz, which is the emanation of the Council of Europe, the motor, and they developed this cadre des approches plurielles, where they describe with descriptors this dimension of intercultural and plurilingual knowledge. And the interesting thing is that they really have attitudes, capacities, and knowledge. And it's very interesting because it really describes a big area. It's hard to say what is really the field of language teaching, what is working on your vision, on your attitudes. But we worked with this tool. I don't know if I have answered all the questions.
I guess so. Well,
I think so.
perhaps not, but that's not that. That's good. But it should be applicated to your ideas and your quite interesting indeed. So the second round, short second round. Those who had not taken the opportunity.
That's your last chance of asking questions.
Definitely.
Or making a comment.
Forever and ever in Trento today. No, last second, no. Well, I guess we appreciated that much this fascinating session. It was touching on vital issues, on society, on persons within society, on choices, on the system, but also on values, on that what is all about education, the transmission of values and of beliefs according to European Court. We should have more definitely this kind of debates, Roberto. And thanks again to enable us to bring together all these experts and to raise right questions, vital questions. I would appreciate if we can clap hands to honor all these persons. So, and it's just 34, so 5:30. That's correct. That's, I guess, according to what we do wish, namely to have some fresh air, have a good local beer, or something different. I guess, Roberto, do you have still something to communicate, something on the logistics for tomorrow? Tomorrow morning, 9:15.
9:15.
Not 1 second later, please.
We are going to have the regional and provincial presidents.
Wow.
Give us a welcome address. And then we are going to have this sort of, shall we say, cross-border happening in Italian, German, and Latin, which I think will be fruitful and as constructive as the day of today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So, be happy. We are happy. Be happy. Open the doors, open the windows, and take a nice glass of wine, and we will appreciate each other for the next hours. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you.